Hi, my name is Autif Kamal, and this is another episode of Be Logical. In the last episode of Be Logical, I introduced the concept of a conditional proposition. I showed you how to formulate it, and I said that the value of formulating a conditional proposition is that whether in speech or in writing, if you can identify a cause and effect which are presented as being distant from each other, um, using that cause and effect to formulate a conditional proposition will make their link, their causal link, more obvious. In this episode, I'm going to expand on the idea of a conditional proposition. I'm going to talk about how you can convert a conditional proposition to a categorical proposition, and I'll talk about what the value of that is, and then I'll talk about how to link a series of conditional propositions, and I will get into what the value of that is. Okay? So to start off, I will give you an example of a conditional proposition. And I'm going to start with showing you how to convert that conditional proposition I'm about to present to you. If a farm runs out of crops, they can't feed the animals. Okay? Now think about this. This farm that runs out of crops, any farm that has that identical cause will also have the identical result. Okay? Assuming that this conditional proposition is true. Okay? So if that's true, then that means that no farm that runs out of crops can feed its animals. That is a negative universal categorical proposition. Okay? So just to summarize, if you have an identical cause, you know for sure that you have an identical cause, and you know that the effect that follows doesn't need to follow from it, then whenever you have that same cause, in any case, you'll have that same effect. Okay? And here's another example of how to convert a conditional proposition to a categorical proposition. If a farm has crops, it can feed its animals. Okay? Now again, any farm that has those identical, that identical cause will also have the identical result, assuming that that result does indeed follow from that cause. Okay? So that means any farm that also has crops will also be able to feed its animals. And it's by that reasoning that I make the conversion to every farm that has crops can feed its animals. Okay? And we're assuming that if the farm had crops, the animals would want to eat those crops. They wouldn't want to starve instead of eating those crops. Okay? Alright, so that's some examples of how to convert conditional propositions to a categorical proposition. Oh, and the categorical proposition, every farm that has crops can feed its animals, is a positive universal categorical proposition. Okay? Now I'm going to move on to how to link a series of conditional propositions. I'm going to expand on the last example that I just used, or rather the first example that I just used. If a farm runs out of crops, they can't feed their animals. If they can't feed their animals, the animals won't survive. If the animals don't survive, they cannot sell livestock. Okay? And that's why we get the final conditional proposition. If the farm runs out of crops, they cannot sell livestock. Okay? Now let me analyze that for you. Now first, notice that every conditional proposition that follows, whatever the cause is for the next conditional proposition, will be the effect of the conditional proposition that came right before it. So for example, if a farm runs out of crops, they can't feed their animals. If they can't feed their animals, the animals won't survive. So if they can't feed their animals is the effect of the first proposition, but the cause of the conditional proposition which comes right after it. Okay? Now, assuming that these three conditional propositions are all accurate, then you can also make that link of if the farm runs out of crops, they cannot sell livestock. And that final conditional proposition that we have, it consists of the cause of the first conditional proposition and the effect of the very last conditional proposition. And if you were to look at just that final conditional proposition, the link between the two wouldn't be quite as obvious as if you actually did those three linking conditional propositions. And what I would say the value is of linking those conditional propositions is, number one, making the connection between the first cause, or rather the cause of the first conditional proposition with the effect of the last conditional proposition, and also by linking those conditional propositions, it makes it clear to you that you actually can connect that first cause and that last effect. Okay. Now, using that information, using those examples that I just gave you, I'm going to apply it to an article pertaining to a nanny who committed a stabbing. Alright, so the title of this article is NYC Nanny Stabbing, When is a Child Too Young to Remember Trauma? I got this article from yahoo.com, and it's by Susan Donaldson James of ABC News. Now, the gist of this article is that Nessie Krim, a 3-year-old, is coming back from a swimming lesson with her mother, and when they enter their house, they find that Nessie's siblings had their throats slit, and they were just lying dead in a tub. And this was done by Jocelyn Ortega, and she also had cut her own throat and slit her wrists. And basically, the main topic of this article is whether a child as young as 3 years old would be traumatized, given that they would probably not be able to make much sense of this situation. Now, I don't want to focus too much on that. There's only one small part that I want to focus on, and in the article it's about 13 lines down. I'll start off right now. Okay. So the easier part to address is that the mother will have a huge traumatic reaction to this, and it will likely change the interaction with the 3-year-old. You can't fault the mom for anything, but depressed moms are less engaged with their children. Okay, so the first conditional proposition that I formulate is, if a mother has a huge traumatic reaction, she will be depressed. Okay, now the reason why I formulated that conditional proposition is because I'm not necessarily convinced that a person who is traumatized is also depressed. Okay, so by leaving it in a conditional proposition as I did, I'm leaving it open to consideration about whether a person who is traumatized is also depressed. And just to go a little bit on a tangent, the reason why I'm not convinced that a person who is traumatized is also depressed is because someone who has a trauma could have it for the long term, but they can also have it for a short term, whereas a person who is depressed, that generally implies a long-term reaction. So that's just to explain why I thought that was an assumption that wasn't yet proven. Okay? Or that I'm at least simply not convinced of. Okay, so next conditional proposition is, if a mother is depressed, she'll be less engaged with their children. Okay, so there you have at least 2 conditional propositions, and that's the minimum we need to link a cause and effect which are not directly, or at least not presented as being directly connected. And then so we get, if a mother has a huge traumatic reaction, she'll be less engaged with her children. Okay, so that's how we link those propositions. And again, notice that the effect of the first conditional proposition is the cause of the next conditional proposition. Okay, and then notice again with the final conditional proposition that I presented, notice that the final conditional proposition consists of the cause of the first conditional proposition, if a mother has a huge traumatic reaction, and the effect of the second conditional proposition. She will be less engaged with their children. Okay, now using that final conditional proposition that I formulated, I'm going to convert it to a categorical proposition. And this is what I get. Every mother who has a huge traumatic reaction is less engaged with their children. Now, the advantage of converting that conditional proposition to the categorical proposition just mentioned is that, at least for me, it might differ depending on who you are or depending on the conditional proposition at the time. It makes it clear about how that proposition can be refuted. So how would you refute the now converted proposition, every mother who has a huge traumatic reaction is less engaged with their children? Well, the categorical proposition that would have to be true would be some mothers who have a huge traumatic reaction are not less engaged with their children. In other words, you would have to find at least one mother who has a huge traumatic reaction that is not less engaged with their children. Okay, and again, I just want to restate that I think converting, in this case at least, converting a conditional proposition to a categorical proposition makes it more clear about how the categorical proposition can be refuted. And if it's clear about how the categorical proposition can be refuted, then it will also be clear about how the conditional proposition, which was converted, can be refuted as well. Okay, and that concludes this episode of Be Logical. And thank you. And please let me know if you have any comments about how I could either make these concepts easier to understand or more substantive for you. Okay, alright, thank you. Bye.